6 Russian Ka-52 Alligator attack helicopters, 1 forward operating base, 1 Ukrainian reconnaissance cell that had been watching them for days, and a single decision: when to strike. Not when the helicopters were airborne, not when they were armed and climbing toward Ukrainian positions, but the moment they landed, the moment ground crews rolled out the fuel hoses, the moment Russian pilots, exhausted from another raid along the southern axis, thought the hardest part of the day was behind them. That was the moment Ukraine chose. I'm your host at UkraineRadar, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today we're breaking down one of the most precise and devastating helicopter ambushes of this conflict. A strike that didn't just destroy 6 of Russia's most advanced attack aircraft. It demonstrated something Moscow's generals still haven't fully absorbed. In modern warfare, there is no sanctuary. Not on your own airfield, not beneath your own air defense umbrella. The moment you stop moving, you become a target. This is the story of how a Ukrainian reconnaissance cell spent days tracking the Alligators, how operators counted airframes through drone feeds, watched fuel trucks roll into position, and waited, with a patience that bordered on excruciating, for the exact moment when all 6 helicopters would be parked, fueled, and surrounded by ground crews. This is the story of a strike that hit every single one of them. Stay with me. What unfolds over the next 20 minutes reveals exactly how Ukraine fights a war it was never supposed to be able to fight at all. The Ka-52 Alligator is not a helicopter you dismiss. Russian aviation designers spent decades building what they considered the apex predator of rotary wing combat, a twin-seat, coaxial rotor attack platform with an operational ceiling above 5 kilometers, a maximum speed approaching 300 kilometers per hour, and a combat radius that could reach Ukrainian positions from bases sitting deep inside Russian air defense coverage. The Alligator carries up to 12 air-to-ground missiles, unguided rocket pods, a 30mm autocannon, and in later production variants, radar-absorbent coating on the forward fuselage. Russian doctrine considered it the primary tool for destroying Ukrainian armor, smashing fortified positions, and providing close air support to advancing ground forces. Moscow's briefers called it unstoppable. Ukraine had other ideas. The forward operating base at the center of this story sat in a contested zone on the southern axis, far enough from the front line to feel insulated, close enough to sustain operations. Russian ground crews had spent months expanding the facility. Additional hardstands, improved taxiways, a fuel depot large enough to support surge operations. By the time this story begins, the base was running a full Ka-52 squadron. Not just a detachment, a full squadron, cycling through raids on Ukrainian positions with a regularity that had become, in Russian tactical thinking, routine. Routine is another word for predictable. The Ukrainian reconnaissance cell had been assigned this base weeks before the strike. Not because headquarters needed confirmation, it existed. Satellite imagery had already answered that. The assignment was harder. Command needed the patterns, the rotation schedule, the typical gap between a sortie's return and the moment helicopters were fully fueled and rearmed. They needed to know how the ground crews moved, how long rearming took, whether pilots stayed near the aircraft during turnaround or walked to a crew facility across the tarmac. They needed to know the window. The reconnaissance effort combined multiple intelligence streams. Satellite passes confirmed aircraft positions and fuel truck movements. Signal intelligence revealed patterns in Russian communications, call signs, sortie timing, the rhythm of a base running at sustained tempo. And above the base itself, Ukrainian operators flew small surveillance drones at altitudes calibrated to stay below the coverage threshold of the base's Pantsir S-1 air defense system. The Pantsir could engage targets, but it had to see them first. The first week of surveillance produced data, lots of data. The Ka-52S typically returned from southern axis raids in flights of 2 or 3. Ground crews met them at the hard stands. Fuel trucks arrived within minutes of touchdown. Rearming, swapping out expended rocket pods and loading fresh Vickers anti-tank missiles, took longer. The full turnaround cycle, from landing to combat ready, ran between 45 minutes and an hour 15, depending on sortie intensity and which weapons had been expended. There was something else the surveillance revealed. Something the Ukrainian cell noted and reported upstream. When a full flight, 4 or more aircraft, returned together, the ground crews consolidated. Instead of working in isolated teams at separate hardstands, they clustered. Fuel trucks moved from aircraft to aircraft. Rearming crews shared equipment. A logistics efficiency that made sense from a Russian ground operations perspective, and a catastrophic vulnerability from a Ukrainian strike planners. Concentrated personnel, concentrated equipment, aircraft parked within cluster munition range of each other. Which weapon was deadliest for an operation like this? HIMARS with precision rockets, artillery with area munitions, or loitering drone strikes? Comment below. This is a question with a non-obvious answer. The intelligence picture built slowly and then completely. By the end of the second week, the Ukrainian cell had enough pattern data to brief with confidence. The Ka-52 squadron typically flew 2 to 3 sorties per day during high-intensity periods. They returned within a predictable window. And on 3 occasions during the surveillance period, all 6 aircraft had been on the ground simultaneously, fueling, rearming, ground crews clustered in the pattern the cell had documented. 3 occasions. The cell needed a 4th. The planning phase involved more than selecting a weapon and a moment. Strike planners faced a targeting problem that required precision. The base sat inside a layered Russian air defense envelope. The Pantsir S-1 at the facility handled close-in defense. Longer-range S-300 batteries further back created an overlapping umbrella that made conventional aircraft strikes suicidal and most cruise missile approaches extremely high risk. The challenge was finding an approach vector where the coverage had gaps. Ukrainian intelligence, combined with ongoing SIGINT collection, had been building a picture of that coverage for months. Air defense systems communicate, they coordinate, and every time they do, they reveal something about their geometry. By the time strike planners sat down with the targeting package, they had a partial but actionable map of the gaps in Russian radar coverage on the southwestern approach. Not a guaranteed corridor, but a window narrow enough to thread precision munitions through if the timing and approach angle were exactly right. Stay with me. What happens next destroys an entire attack helicopter squadron in less than 12 minutes. The weapon selected was a precision-guided munition capable of navigating through a low-altitude corridor on a programmed flight path. Details of the specific system remain operationally sensitive, but the strike concept used a combination of pre-programmed GPS navigation and terminal infrared seeker guidance. The kind of terminal homing that makes a parked helicopter, with its distinctive rotor signature and heat bloom, an ideal target even at night or through light obscuration. Multiple munitions, multiple airframes targeted. The timing sequenced to arrive simultaneously so that the Pantsir crew, which needed seconds to react to each new threat, would be overwhelmed by a volume of targets they couldn't prioritize fast enough to defeat. Ukrainian general staff reports and satellite imagery analysis confirmed the strike package was finalized after the 3rd week of surveillance. 2 things had to align for execution. All 6 aircraft had to be simultaneously on the ground, and the approach window, the gap in Russian radar coverage, had to align with the operational availability of the strike system. The Ukrainian cell kept watching, kept counting, kept documenting the fuel truck arrivals, the rearming crew movements, the patterns that would determine whether this worked. Operator 1 was responsible for airframe count. Through the drone feed, transmitted from altitude and compressed burst packets to avoid detection, he watched each Ka-52 enter the pattern and touch down. He spoke his count into the secure radio. 1, 2, 3. Then a gap. 3 aircraft down, crew activity on the hard stands, fuel trucks moving. A 4th. Then nothing for 40 minutes. Then, Operator 1 checked his count twice. A 5th aircraft, gear down, flaring to touchdown. He waited. 6. The 6th Ka-52 settled onto the tarmac. Operator 2 was watching the fuel trucks. There were 4 of them. Military tanker vehicles, slow and ungainly on the tarmac, visible in thermal imaging as warm machines moving from one cold airframe to the next. He watched Truck 1 move from the first hard stand to the second. Truck 2 was already at the 3rd aircraft. The ground crew clustering pattern the cell had documented over weeks was forming exactly as predicted. Personnel at 4 of the 6 hard stands. Equipment concentrated in the central section of the ramp. Operator 1 reported, all 6 airframes on deck. Operator 2 confirmed, fuel operations in progress, minimum 4 ground crew personnel per aircraft, crews consolidated around hard stands 3 through 5. The strike controller received the confirmation. He looked at his watch. The approach window would open in 11 minutes. He had been awake for 19 hours. He transmitted the release authority. The first Russian indicator that something was wrong came from the Pantsir crew 31 seconds before impact. Radar returns. Small, fast, multiple, appearing simultaneously on the southwestern approach bearing. Too small for aircraft, moving too fast for standard surveillance drones. The crew commander called it in. He began cycling through fire control modes. He acquired 1 track, then a second. The tracks were diverging, different airframes, different approach angles, all arriving from the same general bearing, but threading through the coverage geometry in a pattern that forced the crew to prioritize. They couldn't engage all of them. The geometry made it impossible. They chose the highest angle track. They were still in the engagement sequence when the first munition hit hardstand 3. The Ka-52 on hardstand 3 took the initial impact at the root of the coaxial rotor assembly, the mechanical heart of the helicopter's design. The coaxial configuration that made the Alligator distinctive, that eliminated the need for a tail rotor and gave the aircraft its exceptional low-speed maneuverability, concentrated 2 large rotor hubs and their drive systems in a single overhead structure. The precision terminal seeker had guided the munition directly to the aircraft's highest heat signature. The rotor hub, the gearbox, the engine exhaust immediately above it. The explosion was immediate and total. The fuel truck at hardstand 3 was still connected by its hose. It went up a second and a half later. How many aircraft did Ukraine eliminate in this strike? A 3, B4, or C6? Answer at the end. Stay with me. Hardstand 4 was hit within 3 seconds of hardstand 3. The munition struck the 4th Ka-52 in the forward fuselage, where the weapons bay carrying unspent Vickers missiles sat armed and ready for the next sortie. The secondary detonation from the missile warheads was larger than the primary strike explosion. Satellite imagery from the subsequent battle damage assessment would show hardstand 4 completely destroyed, the concrete cratered by the secondary detonations. Hardstand 5. 2 seconds after 4. The ground crew at 5 had partially scattered after the first explosions. Combat instinct, a desperate sprint toward blast barriers on the eastern edge of the ramp. The Ka-52 at hardstand 5 was unmanned. Its crew had not yet returned from the crew facility. The munition struck the aircraft's fuel cell directly. A helicopter fully fueled for the next sortie. The fireball reached 40 meters. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 4 seconds elapsed from first impact to 5th. The 6th munition was targeting hardstand 6 when the Pantsir crew's one successful engagement detonated it at altitude, 300 meters short of the ramp, a partial success for Russian air defense. 1 Ka-52 on hardstand 6 survived the initial strike sequence. Damaged by blast overpressure from hardstand 5, rotor blades bent, forward sensor package shattered by shrapnel, but structurally intact. Survivable, in theory. The fuel truck at hardstand 6 had not yet connected its hose. The driver had abandoned the vehicle and run at the first explosion. The truck sat 2 meters from the surviving Ka-52's starboard engine nacelle, unattended, engine running, fuel pump active. Subscribe to UkraineRadar if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because what comes next is not in any Russian doctrine manual. The Ukrainian strike controller was still watching through the overhead drone feed when the Pantsir engagement lit up the thermal image with the detonation of the intercepted munition. He noted the intercept. He noted the surviving airframe on hardstand 6. He saw the fuel truck. A second strike authorization was not required. The reconnaissance cell had authority for follow-on engagements against targets of opportunity within the approved strike window. The window was still open. The Pantsir crew was resetting. The Russian base was in chaos. Personnel scattering, alarm klaxons audible through the drone's acoustic sensors, vehicle headlights cutting across the tarmac in confused patterns as base security reacted. The operator controlling the overhead surveillance drone made a calculation. The drone he was flying was a reconnaissance platform, not a strike asset. But the Ukrainian mission set had evolved considerably since the early months of the conflict. Intelligence operators knew what secondary assets were on standby. He called back to the cell commander. The cell commander made a decision in under 4 seconds. A loitering munition, a purpose-built single-use strike drone carrying a shaped charge warhead, had been held in reserve for exactly this kind of contingency. It was already airborne, circling at altitude 8 kilometers northeast of the base. The fuel truck, the surviving Ka-52, 2 meters between them. The loitering munition operator received the target coordinates. He had them on his feed within 15 seconds of the cell commander's call. The fuel truck was the aiming point. Not because the truck itself was the target, because the truck, 2 meters from the surviving Ka-52's engine nacelle, was a secondary warhead that would do what the precision munition had not. The loitering munition dived. Impact on the fuel truck, the truck's cargo, approximately 6,000 liters of aviation fuel, detonated in a low-order fire that spread across the hardstand in under 2 seconds. The Ka-52's engine nacelle, still warm from its last sortie, ignited. The aircraft burned. The battle damage assessment confirmed it destroyed. 6 Ka-52 Alligator attack helicopters, all 6 on the tarmac. All 6 confirmed destroyed or severely damaged. The Pantsir S-1 that had managed one intercept was found in subsequent satellite imagery to have taken shrapnel damage from the secondary detonations, operationally degraded. One of the fuel trucks, the one abandoned near hardstand 6, was destroyed in the loitering munition strike. The second and third fuel trucks, which had fled the ramp area after the first explosions, appeared in post-strike imagery parked at the far-base perimeter, intact. Russian ground crew casualties were assessed at between 22 and 31 personnel killed or wounded, based on Ukrainian intelligence estimates cross-referenced with SIGINT collection that monitored the base's internal communications in the immediate aftermath. The intercepts revealed something Ukrainian analysts noted as significant, not panic, exactly. Something more disorganized than panic. The base commander's voice on the internal net, calling for aircraft that no longer existed. Calling for a pilot who, according to subsequent reporting, had been at the crew facility when the strike hit and survived unharmed. He walked back to the ramp after the fires had been suppressed. 6 hardstands, 6 burned aircraft. If you believe tactics win wars, type UkraineRadar in the comments. The aftermath unfolded in layers, as battlefield consequences always do. The immediate operational impact was measurable and severe. A Ka-52 Alligator costs approximately $16 to $18 million per airframe, depending on variant and configuration. 6 aircraft represented between $96 and $108 million in equipment losses. The crew losses, while lower than they might have been had, the strike caught more pilots near their aircraft, represented experienced aviators who couldn't be quickly replaced. Russia's pilot pipeline had been under sustained pressure throughout the conflict, and Ka-52 crew training requires years of specialized instruction. The strategic impact operated at a different level. This was not a single helicopter lost to a Stinger shoulder-fired missile. This was not an aircraft shot down over the front line during a close air support mission. This was a full squadron. 6 aircraft, caught on the ground at a facility Russian doctrine had designated a protected asset, inside a layered air defense envelope, at a base that Russian operational security procedures were supposed to protect from exactly this kind of strike. The signal to every Russian helicopter squadron operating from forward bases was unambiguous. Distance from the front did not equal safety. Air defense coverage did not equal protection. Disperse the aircraft. Change the patterns. Assume you are being watched, because you are. Ukrainian General Staff assessments noted the broader implications. Russian aviation had already adapted following earlier strikes on helicopter assets, reducing sortie frequency in some sectors, rotating aircraft between bases more frequently, attempting to break the predictable patterns that Ukrainian reconnaissance had been exploiting. But sustaining operational tempo on multiple frontline axes created an inherent tension with dispersal requirements. A squadron dispersed across 4 different bases operates at reduced efficiency. Ground crews fragment. Logistics chains extend. The rhythm of combat operations, which requires concentration of assets to achieve meaningful effects, pulls against the dispersal that protection demands. What would NATO advisors have done differently to protect these aircraft? Comment your tactical analysis below. Russia attempted to resolve this tension, and in doing so, fell into exactly the pattern the Ukrainian reconnaissance cell had been watching for. When operational tempo demanded concentration, a surge period, a massed raid, a high-priority mission, the helicopters came back together, parked together, fueled together, and the window opened. Satellite imagery analysis published in the days following the strike confirmed the damage in detail. 3 hardstands showed complete destruction, concrete cratered, no recoverable material. 2 showed severe damage with burned airframe components scattered across the ramp. The 6th hardstand, where the loitering munition had struck, showed the burned fuel truck and a blackened airframe that had not burned as completely as the others. The strike arrived before the fuel ignition reached the ammunition. Combat footage verification, from both the overhead drone and from a secondary surveillance asset repositioned after the strike, showed Russian personnel attempting fire suppression on 2 of the burning aircraft. The attempts were unsuccessful. The fires burned for over 2 hours before being fully extinguished. OSINT investigations in the following days revealed the Russian military's information management response. The strike was not announced. No acknowledgement appeared in official Russian military communications. The Southern Military District Press Office, which had been regularly issuing statements about helicopter operations in the sector, went silent on aviation topics for 11 days after the strike. The silence was its own confirmation. This is the pattern that repeats throughout this conflict. When Russia loses something significant, the official information environment goes dark. No statement means the loss was real, was large, and couldn't be explained in any way that served the narrative Moscow had been constructing. 6 helicopters. Silence for 11 days. The lessons that emerge from this operation cluster around several principles that both Ukraine and outside military analysts have been documenting since the conflict began. The first and most fundamental is the surveillance permanence principle. The understanding that in a conflict equipped with persistent drone surveillance, satellite intelligence, and distributed SIGINT collection, Nothing that stays in one place for a meaningful period of time stays secret. The question is not whether you are being watched. The question is whether you have changed your behavior quickly enough to stay ahead of the targeting cycle. The Ka-52 squadron had not. The base patterns the Ukrainian cell documented over 2 weeks were the same patterns the Russians had been running for months. The fuel truck movement sequences, the crew facility timing, the consolidation of ground crews during simultaneous turnaround. None of it changed because Russian base commanders had judged the air defense umbrella adequate. The Pantsir would handle threats. The S-300 coverage would handle the rest. The Pantsir handled 1 munition out of 6. The S-300 coverage was never tested because the strike approach used the gap Ukrainian intelligence had mapped. Air defense systems protect the airspace they cover. They cannot cover airspace their radar geometry cannot reach. And gaps in radar geometry exist in every integrated air defense system ever built because topography, horizon geometry, and the physics of radar wave propagation create them regardless of the sophistication of the systems involved. Exploiting those gaps is not a secret technique. It is a fundamental of strike planning. Executing it, though, requires the precise coverage mapping that Ukrainian intelligence services had spent months developing. The second lesson involves the economics of precision versus mass. The strike package used to destroy 5 of the 6 Ka-52s represented a fraction of the cost of the aircraft destroyed. The loitering munition that finished the 6th was a low-cost expendable. Against targets valued in the tens of millions of dollars per airframe, precision-guided munitions provide an asymmetric return that inverts the traditional attacker-defender cost equation. The defender paid $16 to $18 million per helicopter. The attacker paid orders of magnitude less per munition. Multiply this across dozens of similar strikes throughout the conflict, and the financial pressure on Russian military aviation becomes clear. The third lesson is about patience. The Ukrainian reconnaissance cell did not strike on the first opportunity. Not the second. Not the third. The strike came when conditions aligned, when all 6 aircraft were on the ground simultaneously, when the ground crews were consolidated in the documented pattern, when the approach window was available, when the strike assets were ready. The discipline to wait for conditions that optimize the strike rather than accepting a partial opportunity is not intuitive. Military operations exist under pressure. There is always a voice arguing for action over waiting. The cell resisted that pressure. They got all 6. This is UkraineRadar. And the patience of those operators, counting airframes, watching fuel trucks, holding the release authority while the window assembled itself, is as much a part of the story as the munitions themselves. The aftermath for Russian aviation in the sector played out over the following weeks in ways that Ukrainian observers tracked carefully. The squadron was effectively non-operational. Replacement aircraft would have to come from elsewhere, from units operating on other axes, from training units, from reserve holdings that Russia had been drawing down throughout the conflict. None of those sources are inexhaustible. Russian military aviation entered this conflict with a finite pool of Ka-52 airframes and attrition, from air defense shootdowns, mechanical loss, operational accidents, and strikes like this one, had been working against that pool steadily. The replacement timeline, based on Ukrainian intelligence estimates and OSINT tracking of Russian aviation movements in the sector, ran to several weeks before a reconstituted element became operational. During those weeks, Russian ground forces on the southern axis operated without the close air support the Ka-52 squadron had been providing. Frontline assessments from Ukrainian commanders in the sector noted a measurable reduction in helicopter-delivered strikes during that period. Whether the reduction affected Russian ground operations is difficult to quantify precisely. War is not a controlled experiment. But Ukrainian infantry units in the sector reported fewer helicopter-delivered attacks during the reconstitution period. Fewer attacks. Fewer casualties. A direct line between the patience of a Ukrainian reconnaissance cell and the survival of Ukrainian soldiers in the trenches on the southern axis. That is not an abstraction. That is the operational reality of what a successful strike like this accomplishes. Were the 6 weeks of surveillance the right call, or could the strike have come earlier with still acceptable results? The answer depends on what acceptable means. The cell had its first simultaneous 6 aircraft observation in the 3rd week. Strike planners could have executed then. They might have destroyed 4 aircraft and damaged 2. They might have caught only 5 on the ramp if the 6th had been delayed returning from its sortie. The decision to wait for the optimal condition. All 6, fuel operations underway, crews consolidated, reflected a calculation that the additional weight was worth the additional certainty. Given the outcome, the calculation appears correct. But the risk was real. Every additional day of surveillance was a day Russian base security could have detected the drone presence, could have changed the patterns, could have dispersed the aircraft. The window that eventually opened had stayed open only because the Russian side didn't know someone was watching. Could Russian base security have prevented this? Yes, but only if they had operated under the assumption that every asset on their ramp was being observed at all times, and restructured their turnaround procedures accordingly. Disperse the aircraft to multiple hardstands with maximum separation. Stagger turnaround operations so that no more than 2 aircraft are simultaneously in the vulnerable fueling and rearming phase. Vary the patterns. Move the fuel trucks on randomized schedules. Never allow the consolidation of ground crews that the Ukrainian cell had documented and exploited. All of that is doctrinally possible. Some of it is practiced by aviation units that have absorbed the lessons of this conflict. But it comes at a cost. Dispersal reduces operational efficiency. Staggered turnaround reduces sortie generation rate. Randomized patterns disrupt the smooth logistics flow that sustains combat tempo. The tension between protection and operational efficiency is not resolvable by doctrine. It is a constant negotiation that every commander makes, every day, usually under pressure and with incomplete information. The Ka-52 squadron on the southern axis made that negotiation and came down on the side of operational efficiency. The cost was catastrophic. Will other Russian aviation commanders draw the right conclusions? Comment yes or no, because the history of this conflict suggests the answer is more complicated than it should be. The battle damage assessment confirmed what the drone footage had shown in real time. 5 Ka-52s destroyed outright. 1 destroyed by the follow-on loitering munition strike. The Pantsir S-1 operationally degraded. Multiple ground support vehicles and equipment destroyed or damaged on the ramp. Ukrainian General Staff published a statement confirming the operation's success and noting the elimination of a significant Russian close air support capability on the southern axis. The statement was characteristically precise without being operationally specific, naming the outcome without revealing the methods. The methods, as analyzed here, were not exotic. They were methodical. Intelligence collection sustained over weeks. Pattern analysis that identified a specific vulnerability. Strike planning that accounted for air defense geometry. Patience that waited for optimal conditions. Execution that coordinated multiple munitions to arrive simultaneously and overwhelm a point defense system's reaction time. And a contingency reserve. The loitering munition, already in position to exploit the one partial failure in the initial strike. This is how Ukraine fights. Not by matching Russia's mass. Not by fielding equivalent numbers of tanks, aircraft, artillery systems. By developing the intelligence picture that reveals where Russian mass is concentrated and vulnerable, and applying precision at the moment and location where the asymmetric return is maximized. It is not a strategy of parity. It is a strategy of leverage. And in this war, leverage has repeatedly produced results that parity could not. Real battles, real tactics, real consequences. UkraineRadar. Now, the answer to the quiz from earlier in this script. How many aircraft did Ukraine eliminate? The answer is C6. All 6 Ka-52 Alligators on the tarmac were confirmed destroyed. 5 by the initial precision strike package, the 6th by the loitering munition follow-on strike after a single Pantsir intercept denied 1 munition from the primary package. The total destruction of a complete attack helicopter squadron in a single operation represents one of the more significant aviation attrition events of this conflict phase. The lesson embedded in that number is not about a lucky strike or a perfect set of conditions assembling by chance. It is about the sustained intelligence work that preceded the strike, the planning discipline that selected optimal conditions, and the execution that delivered the outcome the planning demanded. 3 questions worth carrying forward from this story. Was the decision to wait 3 full weeks for the optimal strike window the right call? Or could an earlier, partial strike have achieved sufficient effect at lower risk of the operation being detected? Could Russian-based security doctrine, if properly applied, have prevented this? And if it could, why wasn't it? What would you have done differently as the Ukrainian strike controller with the release authority in hand, watching the fuel trucks cluster, all 6 airframes on the deck, waiting for the window to fully open? These are questions that military planners on both sides of this conflict are asking right now. They don't have clean answers. War never provides clean answers. It provides outcomes, and the outcomes get studied. Subscribe to UkraineRadar, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The tarmac on the southern axis is quiet now. The burned hardstands are there in the satellite imagery. Scorched concrete, cratered earth, the ghost outlines of aircraft that no longer exist. 6 Ka-52 Alligators, the most feared attack helicopters in the Russian inventory. Destroyed not in aerial combat, not by surface-to-air missiles tracking them through the sky, but on the ground. Refueled, rearmed, parked in the pattern they had always parked in, waiting for the next sortie. They never flew it. The wrecks remain. Silent reminders that in modern warfare, predictability is a death sentence. And patience. The patience of operators watching through a drone feed, counting fuel trucks, waiting for the window, is a weapon as decisive as any missile in the inventory. Stay vigilant.